Okay guys, I want to start off, this is a discussion of the causes of World War I, and it goes with a handout that says causes of World War I at the top, and then it's going to have like factors that influenced our entry. It's just a graphic organizer. So, I want to start off by helping you understand a really big distinction between America and Europe, okay? In America, we have always been really obsessed with the color of your skin, okay? And that's been the major social organizing principle of our country. White people from different ethnic origins of Europe came over here and for a while lived in ethnic islands that were very distinct. But in time, people with white-colored skin intermarried, and as a result, we got kind of what was called Caucasian, but people of European descent, though, who had white skin. And they were considered distinct from black Americans. Black and white people did not intermarry in general. It was either in the North because of custom or in the South due to law. But race remained the kind of organizing principle of our country. So I'm using salt and pepper to help you remember that. We kind of divided ourselves like salt and pepper, right? White, black, really easy to distinguish, and visible. Okay? Now, Europe has a different social principle, and it's called ethnicity. Okay? And I'm using these two salad dressings to help you understand ethnicity. Okay? Because this confuses Americans, because in Europe, a lot of people have very similar skin, meaning they both look the same on the outside, but yet there's huge distinctions on the inside. And we all know that blue cheese and ranch dressing have very different qualities, right? They taste very different, even though they look the same on the outside. And it's that kind of nuance that is typical to Europeans who think about ethnicity, okay? Your ethnicity is not about the color of your skin, it's about the food you eat, the dresses, the clothes you wear, the celebrations you participate in, a whole slew of really kind of complex, nuanced factors. But in Europe, they're very clear about who's what ethnicity, okay? The Italians know who the Italians are, and the Germans know who the Germans are, and these used to be tribes before nations were formed. And so these kind of ethnic distinctions are very significant to Europeans, though in America sometimes we get confused because we don't understand that the basis for those distinctions are not racial, as they are in America. They are ethnic, okay? And a lot of Caucasian Americans, as a result, have kind of lost track of their ethnic origins and don't really have an ethnic identity. They're actually a little confused about their ethnic identity, and white is not really an ethnic identity at all. So, as a result, that's the distinction between the United States and our focus on race versus the Europeans and their focus on ethnicity. The reason why that's important is in the causes of World War I, there's a lot of ethnic tensions in Europe. People who their skin might be the same color, but they have very different sense of identity tied to their ethnicity. Okay? So let's look at the long-term causes of World War I, because some of those long-term causes focus on nationalism, okay? And there's two types of nationalism going on. First of all, there's kind of a growth in identity in Europe of people with being part of a nation, okay? So now nations have formed in Europe, the nation state, and we have Germany, and we have France, and we have Britain. And those countries have a sense of competitiveness and a sense of pride within themselves and against others. But then also there's this other kind of nationalism going on. It's these ethnic groups like the Slavs, the Poles, the Serbs. They have a sense of ethnic pride, and right now they're kind of trapped in other countries. For example, Austria-Hungary is a large nation that contains all these different ethnicities, and they don't want to be part of Austria-Hungary anymore. They want to be their own country. Poland, Serbia, Slovakia, okay? So those are two flavors of nationalism. The nations that already exist are proud and are competing against each other militarily and in terms of imperialism. And then another type of nationalism, which is ethnic groups that want to be nations and be elevated, their ethnic identification to be elevated to a nation status. Okay? Also, those nations then compete with each other over colonies worldwide. We've seen how the Europeans divided up Africa and competed for lands worldwide to expand their military and economic base. And so anytime these European countries then bump into each other, that's going to lead to some long-term tensions between them. We also get militarism. Certainly, in order to defend your colonies, once you have them, you're going to need a strong military, and that manifests itself into an arms race that's mainly focusing on building ships. The size of your navy was indicative of the power of your country during that time period. And so there's going to be a huge naval building push during this time period, and all kinds of innovations in building new types of ships and new technologies related to shipping. Also, these countries start forming, due to intermarriages and other issues, they start to form standing alliances. And here is Europe, and these red countries get together and they decide that they will be standing permanent allies, which means if they are attacked or if one attacks another country, they will all band together and work together. And they're called the Triple Entente, and that is France, Britain, and Russia. So I think this is the first time in world history where these standing alliances are formed. And initially they were secret, but in time became public. And then we have the Triple Alliance. The Triple Alliance is initially made up of these yellow countries, and they were called the Triple Alliance Germany. This is Germany, Austria, Hungary, and Italy. Now, Italy only agreed to join if one of the countries was attacked. They were not willing to join the alliance. They wouldn't come to Austria-Hungary's aid, for example, if Austria-Hungary attacked someone else, only if Austria-Hungary was attacked. Okay? In time, this is going to become the Allied powers, which we joined with France, Britain, and Russia, and the Central powers, because Italy's going to drop out, and the Ottoman Empire is going to join this alliance. So there's going to be a little shifting of alliances throughout the war, with Italy switching sides, so they'll become red, and the Ottoman Empire here will become yellow and form these Central powers, because you can see they're all centrally located with red on either side of them. Okay? A more immediate cause of the war involved the assassination of the future leader of Austria-Hungary. His name was Archduke Ferdinand. Let's back up here a little bit and look at this map. You can see that here's Austria-Hungary, and here is a country called Serbia. Okay? But not all Serbians live in Serbia. Some Serbians were trapped here in Austria-Hungary, and they wanted to either join with Serbia or become an independent nation just for their ethnic group of the Serbs. And Austria-Hungary is opposed to this, so they formed a kind of radical organization called the Black Hand, and it's one of their members that's going to assassinate the future leader of Austria-Hungary, the Archduke Ferdinand. He and his wife, Claudia, were assassinated by a Serb, an ethnic Serb, so not someone who was living in the country of Serbia, but rather someone who considered themselves an ethnic Serb who wanted to be independent from Austria-Hungary. And the Russians had historically been the defender of the Serbs. They identify ethnically. Again, remember how important ethnicity is in Europe. The Russians came to the defense of the Serbs. And so suddenly we have two countries, Russia versus Austria-Hungary. And you can see that they're on different sides of these standing alliances. So Russia comes to the defense of the Serbs within Austria-Hungary. And now Austria-Hungary and Russia are against each other. So the minute those two face off against each other, all the other alliances are going to come into play, and that will very easily be the start of World War I. Okay? So these activating standing alliances will lead the war to actually break out. We'll talk more about this cartoon in class, but it shows very clearly that there seems to be a lot of the blame game going on in terms of who's actually responsible for the war. All right, the next big question, the war begins in 1914. Okay, we are not in the war when it begins. Actually, we don't enter the war until 1917. So the war rages for 3 years before we enter. And some people think we should enter earlier, and some people think we should remain neutral throughout. So let's talk about the people who think we should get into the war. First of all, the Germans are attacking ships that are carrying Americans. Let's talk a little bit about the nature of why the German attacks on American ships are more offensive than the British attacks on American ships. The British are stopping ships from going to Germany. Okay, they put a blockade on Germany, and they won't let our ships get through. And the Germans have put a blockade on Britain. So the question is, why are the Germans the only one who everyone's obsessing about them attacking our ships? The reason is this. The British have invested their money in ships. When the British enforced the blockade, they put their ships in front of ours heading to Europe and any ships that are trying to, ours or anyone else's, that are trying to supply Germany. They put a blockade there, they stop the ship, they board the ship, they take the stuff off, steal the supplies so the Germans can't get them, that kind of thing. That's the way they enforce the blockade. So that's pretty rough stuff. I mean, it's forceful and those kinds of things, but it's different than the Germans. The Germans have invested their naval money into a new type of ship called a submarine, or a Untervessel, or a U-boat. A submarine cannot stop a ship, board a ship, take on its cargo. A submarine is under the water, it's small, it can't take on more men or more cargo. So the submarines that the Germans are using to enforce the blockade against the British and keep supplies from reaching their enemy in Britain or France, they have shoot or do nothing is the only thing they can do. The submarine can shoot and try and sink the ship and kill the men and sink all the material on board, or they can do nothing. So as a result, the German blockade seems much more violent and much more offensive than the British or the French attacks on shipping, okay? And that's why the Germans' attacks get a lot more higher profile coverage in the paper and those things, because they're inherently more violent, because those are the limitations that submarines have. You can't really play nice in a submarine. It's shoot or do nothing. So, when the Germans start attacking ships that are carrying Americans, for example, the Lusitania, which is a British ship, it's not an American ship, but there are Americans on board who are killed, then a lot of Americans start saying that we need to get involved to protect our citizens. That was a cruise ship, though. It was a British cruise ship. The people had been warned that it was a dangerous time to be on the high seas, and they chose to do that, but still after the fact, a lot of people were outraged at the killing of Americans. Also, we loaned a lot of money to Britain and France during World War I, and therefore our money is tied up with those two countries, and if they lose, we are going to lose our investments, okay? A country that's defeated in war will not repay its debts, and so suddenly a lot of American investors have an incentive for the British and the French to win, lest they not get back their money that they had loaned them. Now, other people feel like that's a stupid reason to go to war. If wealthy people have chosen to invest their money in a way that is high risk, that does not really involve why poor men should be drafted to go to war, and that's a problem of the wealthy, and that this should not be a rich man's war and a poor man's fight. We know that the wealthy are probably the ones who've made the loans, and that they're probably not going to be the ones who are going to go fight, and therefore a lot of people supporting neutrality thought that the average man shouldn't go fight for the rich man's investments. Also, a lot of people just thought, we have a big ocean between us and Europe, and it's a nice insurance policy that we don't need to get involved in the affairs of Europe, and that we should just stay out and mind our own business. This was the foreign policy that had been advocated by George Washington, for example. Good old isolationism. However, we're going to intercept a telegram between Germany and Mexico. It is called the Zimmermann Note, and we're going to look at the Zimmermann Note in class. But basically, the Germans approach the Mexicans and say, hey, why don't we propose an alliance with you, Mexico, if America gets involved in the war, and we will fight America with you and get back all of the land in the Southwest that you lost in the Mexican War. And when we intercept this telegraph, and we'll talk about the reasons why it was sent through American territory, but when we intercept this telegraph, it is very clear that the Germans are directly conspiring against us. And so when Woodrow Wilson reads that, he asks Congress for a declaration of war, and we join Britain, France, and Russia and become the allied powers who are going to fight against the Central Powers of Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire. Okay? So this battle here between what we should do wages for quite a few years, but then the Zimmermann Note is really the clear and final indicator that we cannot avoid going to war any longer. And so we will enter the war in 1917. Our troops won't actually hit the ground until 1918, and the war will end in 1918. So not only do the Americans get involved, but it is universally agreed that the Americans' involvement is decisive in bringing a conclusion to the war that up to this point had been a huge stalemate, with neither side really taking ground conclusively. So we'll be looking more at America, how we mobilized for the war, and how we helped win the war in class. Okay, thanks. See you in class.